I have a bad feeling about this. Do not underestimate the power or pain of the lock side. So I had to, I couldn't resist making a kind of a Star Wars reference because the film is coming up soon. Yes, okay. So the content that I will be covering here will be two kind of main areas. So the first thing is why you should localize your game. So basically kind of pointing out the importance of localization. I mean, I'm sure many of you may have already done localization or are maybe embarking the first time. So I wanted to kind of really point out why localization makes a lot of sense in a lot of territories. I'm not going to go into the usual kind of figs, which is kind of the standard, but I will kind of touch on maybe one of those languages, but then also talk about potential other languages. And then when you're actually kind of preparing your content, how to actually kind of make sure that you don't make kind of the same kind of issues, the same kind of problems that occur very, very regularly. So I'm going to try to kind of break down a few of the kind of top line things. Okay, so who am I? So this is me. My name is Mike Souto. I'm the Biz Dev Director at LocalizeDIrect. So the last 10 years I've been at LocalizeDIrect. And then 12 years prior to that I spent in game development as a producer. So I understand the whole kind of development process and also the localization process, which is why I'm going to be sharing this with you today. So our sources, so basically we've taken loads of data from a number of different sources, stuff like Newzoo, T-Index, Steam Stats, etc. So what I've done is kind of chosen what I've thought were the most kind of interesting or most kind of pertinent points that would be useful to share with you guys. But a lot of this stuff is kind of readily available, but I'll try to kind of just develop those a little bit more. Okay, so why you should localize your game. So there's actually 10 countries generate a number of global game revenue. Can anyone guess what that number might be? It's a percentage. What's the percentage covered? How many? 80? Damn you. Okay, number one, you win. Okay. Water? Okay. So so 80%, which is incredible. So if you just touch those 10 languages, of which, if you touched those two of those countries, which is English anyway, which you would probably go into, you're going to cover a lot anyway. But there's a lot of countries on there that you might not potentially consider. And I'll touch on a bit further when we talk about Canada. But certainly, Japan and South Korea. And what I'll do is I'll break down those countries as well. Not all of them, but some of those countries as to kind of why they make sense. Okay, and then the next 10 countries is only 8%. But it's still 8% is still massive. It's still, $11.5 billion. So, so it's definitely worth kind of looking beyond that as well. So not just necessarily looking at those kind of usual 10, or kind of the big 10, but there's also others that you should consider. So one of the things to really think about is, we're in we're in Ukraine, but one of the main things is, most people don't speak English. That's just a simple fact. And another thing is like 52% of people would only buy if the content was in their language. So this is like a really important thing. So a lot of people, if I'm on the Google Play Store, for example, and I see content that's just in kanji, for example, I will instantly just move to the next thing. So I want to be able to understand what the title is, what the kind of the concept behind the game is, not just by looking at the screenshots. Right, so we've got this image, which is you can't see this, I'm sure, but I think I've got it here, which is slightly bigger. Oh. So this is easier to look at. So basically you've got you're very high, moderate, and low. So this is English proficiency. So basically you've got people like the Dutch in the Netherlands that are like scoring at number 1, and you've got China at 40, so it's moderate. And this is kind of their ability to read and to interact with English. So so the importance of these other languages that just simply do not have good proficiency. So if you look at stuff like Japan, they're in the low. If you look at very low, you've got things like you've got Egypt, which is a popular country, Turkey, which is a very popular country as well, and I'll talk more about Turkey as well in a second. So the highlights are low: Japan, Brazil, Mexico. So if you are trying to make some sales in Japan, you really do need to localize. That's just as simple as that. Brazil and Mexico, Mexico, which we'll go into in a second, is it has a lot of potential revenue, so certainly should be touched. And then we've got very low, which is United Arab Emirates, Turkey, and Saudi. And the source is EF. Okay, so the usual suspects. So like I said before, I'm not going to go into kind of the detail on the kind of the usual suspects, but maybe there's some interesting facts in here. So we have Spain, Mexico, and Argentina. traditionally Spanish-speaking countries. So Spain is number 9. This is kind of the usual suspect. But then we have Mexico and Argentina. Mexico is number 12 in global game revenue. And when you look at the population, that is enormous. And the potential games revenue, when it's 1.6 billion, it's not a million miles away from Spain itself. So really, depending on the kind of the content of your game and whether or not you've researched if this is something that would be interesting to the Mexican market, maybe more than the Spanish, you could potentially choose between the two. But again, I'll talk about that in a second. So Spanish is the second most spoken native language after Mandarin and the third most used language on the internet after English and Chinese. So it's used in Spain, of course, and then Latin American countries like Mexico, Colombia, etc. So game devs, traditionally, they just ask for Spanish. It's like, okay, because Spanish can then go into those other countries, and those other countries, they expect European Spanish, so they accept it, but they appreciate that when they're actually playing it, that it doesn't feel natural to them because there are lots of differences between the two. It's understandable, but there's lots of cultural references that are very different from one place to another. So Latin American has grown massively. So this is certainly something should be looked at. So if you have the budget to do it, you should be asking for Spanish and then Latin American Spanish. But Latin American Spanish is a made-up concept. It's not actually a language. But what you can do is you can then ask for this kind of vanilla type Spanish. So can you see? So you can ask for this kind of vanilla, and this vanilla will try to fuse as many of these and try to create this kind of Disney associated Latin American. But ideally, you should be looking to create separate versions for each of these countries, but understandably, some of them are very small. But certainly Mexico is a very interesting one. Okay, so considerations. So one of the, again, this is very much for the developers, is you really need to consider not using dynamic text. So if you're constructing a string using 3 different strings, this is regularly not going to work for Spain, and it's not going to work for a number of different languages. So what you really need to do is try to create one string, maybe with one placeholder. If you try to have more than one placeholder, then it's just horrific. And as many Russian speakers in here, I'm sure, you will understand that that simply doesn't work for your territory. So hopefully you'll bear that in mind anyway. There's things like at the start of strings, like questions, for example, there's an inverted question mark. Now, if a lot of times, again, this is through my own personal development years ago, a lot of people will just remove that question mark. And if you remove that question, because they'll be like, oh, this looks silly. How important can this be? It's like, it's really important, because if you don't feature this character, then the string is going to look like total crap. Okay, and so there's more than one Spanish variant, so you need to consider, is it going to be popular in Mexico, etc. So they have significant differences in vocabulary, grammar, punctuation, and pronunciation. So these are things that you should certainly bear in mind for Spain, or Spanish. Then we have Chinese. Oh, sorry, let me go back. So China. So number 1, there we go, bang. Then we have a massive population, a huge number of gamers. Jesus Christ! I mean, I think everyone understands the importance of China, and of course, their English proficiency is not superb either. Then we have Taiwan and Hong Kong, which I'll go into in a bit more detail. So there's different types of Chinese. There's simplified and traditional. I'm sure that you're probably familiar with that. So simplified Chinese, then you have the 2 traditional Chinese, which is Taiwan and Hong Kong. So when you're requesting translations, then you should be researching which one of those 2 you particularly want to push into, or you might indeed want to do separate versions for each release. So simplified Chinese is primarily spoken in mainland China, which has obviously got that huge population. And then traditional Chinese is in Taiwan, Hong Kong, and then overseas Chinese in Singapore, which is 4.3 million people, and then 7.27 in Malaysia. So that's something that should certainly be borne in mind as well. I say, considerations. So the character count is normally, so Russian is pretty long, English is shorter, and then Spanish is massive, and so is German. But Chinese will regularly be shorter. But the complexity of the characters means that you can't just say, okay, well, the space that I have will just be fine, Well, just because then it's going to be shorter, so that's fine. But the complexity of the characters means that it needs to be much larger on the screen. So you should be budgeting for something that's much higher, which will allow you to display the characters properly. So larger vertical space, larger vertical space. Right, this is a very long piece, but the crux of this kind of last, this part here about length is, I'm sure that you've experienced the kind of the real problems with memory and the amount of characters required, because there are 80,000 of them. So if you're making a mobile game, you don't really want to have a kind of it's enormous download. So we kind of, a lot of people will scan the translated text from their game itself, which is fine. But then obviously if you have dynamic stuff, if you've got like in-game chat and stuff like that, then you need to have all of those characters as well to allow the people to create their player names or whatever. So if you've got that stuff, then ideally if you have the OS will support that, then great. But if not, then maybe it's a good idea not to allow people to enter their own text and keep it to just your text. Okay, so one of the kind of important things for China and to appeal to the Chinese market is, Chinese gamers, they do enjoy Western titles, that's absolutely fine. But if you can incorporate something or tie something into like Singles Day, or if it's Chinese New Year and you can adapt your game and create like a skin or some kind of release around that time, that's going to be massively popular and do great work for your title. Politics, now be very I'm sure we're all fully aware of what's happening in Hong Kong at the moment, but certainly China is, a very kind of strict nation. So obviously politics is something you should try to steer clear of, if ideally. But yeah, so for example, games have been banned for smearing the image of China and the Chinese army. So for example, like Command and Conquer a few years ago. And then monetizing. So you need to kind of bear in mind how they pay in China as well. I'm sure there's other talks that are very, very specific on this subject, but I just touch on it briefly here. So making sure that stuff like Alipay and Tenpay, they're very much used far more frequently in China. So add a QR code. These guys are used to scanning and paying with a fingerprint rather than kind of using credit card, etc. Okay, so on to Korean. So it's number 4. So again, it's kind of like not to be sniffed at. Game revenue of $5.6 billion. So it's kind of like everyone should be making a Korean version. So when we receive requests that say, we just want to do figs and maybe Brazilian, it's like, okay, so are you planning on going into Japan and China and Korea? And they're like, we're kind of thinking about it. It's like, why are you thinking about it? Look, it's number 4. It's number 4. I mean, it's not, it's not so complex a thing anymore. Now you need to, it's a case of, once you ship a game, if there are problems in the game, you can always patch your game. You can always kind of check things afterwards. Obviously, the need for LQA, so language quality assurance, is very important to ensure that the title works in each of those locations. But certainly, Korean is just like a no-brainer. Okay, so then we have, we got stuff that things that I just thought were interesting. So Korean gamers spend a lot of money, which is fabulous news. So close to $200 per year on average. It's like, wow, okay, that's great. That's a lot more than I spend. So mobile games, they generate 85% of total app revenue. And it's just absolutely insane. So it's even higher than other Asian markets. And then 94% of Koreans have a smartphone, which is insane as well. So it's the #1 country, right, in terms of smartphone penetration and internet usage, which is just bonkers. And then 56% of smartphone users use their mobile device more than a computer or tablet. So, you've got this real captured audience that are just going to eat all the time because they're just basically using their phones such an incredible amount. So, more considerations. Right, so, stuff like, so going back into the ordering of like having your variables, which is kind of related to this as well. But a lot of developers, and I was probably guilty of it some years ago, still kind of think that strings are created in the same way as they are in their language. And it's like, it doesn't really work like that. Things have to move around a lot in various languages. So for example, in Korean, I've chosen this one, which is like, for example, select 3 out of 10 weapons. So actually what would happen is, it would read as, out of 10 weapons, select 3. So if you kind of locked in that order, then basically your game is going to read like it's been made by kind of Google Translate or something, which is obviously crap. So looking at stuff like Kakao as well. So a social component in Korea is super important. So ensure that you're supporting that. So almost every smartphone in Korea uses KakaoTalk. So if you can integrate something into KakaoTalk, then that's going to make your game far more popular and far more widespread in Korea. So one of the examples I wanted to point out was Candy Crush. So Candy Crush, they've actually created specifically for the Korean market the ability to communicate through Kakao and share emojis and things like that as well. So they actually kind of made the effort of creating bespoke content for Korea. So if you have the time, the development budget to do that, then you certainly should. On to Japan, number 3. Game revenue, 19.2 billion, Jesus. Pretty big. So yeah, you're looking at kind of gamers wise, it's kind of we're talking about kind of half of the actual population are playing games in some form. It's like, wow, okay, half the people. That's pretty good. So their annual spend is $371 on average, which is absolutely crazy. So they're the highest spenders in the world. So again, like I said before, if people are kind of saying, oh, I'm not sure if I should go into Japan, it sounds, it's going to be a pain, blah, blah. I mean, the facts, speak for themselves. It's kind of like, why would you not want to touch these people? So 77% of gamers spend on in-game items or virtual goods. And a smartphone is the main games medium in Japan. So iOS is the most popular platform out there for these gamers. And in Japan, commuting, so traveling to work, etc., is a big kind of time allocation of people's kind of day. So basically, they use this opportunity to be just playing games all the time. So they're on the train, on the metro, whatever. So you've got this kind of captured audience, and there's that whole kind of commuting thing is really kind of prevalent in Japan. So considerations. Okay, so one of the kind of key things that Japanese players hate is when you don't actually kind of use local terms in terms of like date format or local time, stuff like that. Things like that will instantly make Japanese players go, oh Jesus, I hate this game already. It's like, oh, okay, fine. So yeah, something as simple as that, then it's kind of like, why aren't we doing this? Tone of voice. So this kind of relates to something a bit later on, but it's very, very important to when you provide the information to the localization vendor, to say if there's subtitle or some kind of interaction between characters, is who is delivering that line and who that line is being delivered to and what the relationship is between these people, because it's very hierarchical. So the relationship, social status, is very important in how that is then translated. So the translator could actually provide you with something that when a Japanese player reads it will go, ugh, that's not how that person would speak to that person normally. Again, so this is this kind of ordering thing. So it's very much different to English. So a sentence like "I gameplay" would, "I gameplay" sounds very odd in English, but that's basically the order in Japanese. So you have to allow for that kind of flexibility as well. Okay, so one of the kind of regular complaints that we get is, hey, some of these strings are not translated into Japanese, and that's actually usually that's because that's the way it's intended. Because Japanese gamers expect to see some English. Like English is seen as being quite cool. So if your game does feature kind of game over like that in the Japanese version, they'll be like, hey, that's pretty cool. So they get that kind of that feel, and they're used to it. And if they don't see English, then it's kind of, if they do see game over in Japanese, then they'll go, oh, that's weird. I'm expecting to see that in English. Right, so there's whole papers dedicated to this, but stuff like symbols and colors have meanings as well. So, ensure that, stuff like the number 4, it sounds like death. So, so you kind of want to make sure you kind of steer clear of those things. And 4 items in a package, so like maybe an in-app purchase or something of 4 major killer cards or whatever, that's going to be deemed as a kind of a negative thing. So make it 5 or make it 3. Do your research. So censored violence. So Japan, and again my experience as well, is that I've never had a game banned in Japan, but we've had to go to Zero, and then they've come back and said, okay, so your game's great, but we need you to tone down the blood, or we need to kind of change some of these scenes if there's something rude or whatever. Then they want that to be adapted. So they will then allow that to then be released. But there's special notes. So players should not be like serial killers. Serial killers is kind of like not a very kind of well-received thing in Japan. And children and innocents shouldn't be killed, which I think is fair play, really. Okay, so the unusual suspects. So, growing markets that should be considered. Okay, so Brazil, Portugal. So if you if you translate your game into Brazilian, you can, of course, you can release it in Portugal as well. And so when you look at Portugal, it's like 39 in the list. It's like, it's not so great. But 13 is Brazil, which is pretty immense when you look at the revenue of 1.45 billion. And their English proficiency is very low. Now, this is kind of like, so usually we get requests for or for figs. And Brazil is normally that one that tags onto the end. And then there'll be Japan, Korea, etc. But certainly Brazil has really grown massively. Oh, yeah. So only 5% of Brazilians speak English. Bang. I mean, it's kind of like, okay, you need to, if you're releasing in Brazil, which is this great big market, you need to be translating into Brazilian, into Portuguese. So the official language in 10 countries, the biggest is Brazil and Portugal. And the population of Brazil is 20 times larger than that of Portugal, and revenues are 5 times higher. Okay, but there is differences between the two. But because Portugal is so small, then you kind of think, okay, so do I need to spend the time, the effort to create a specific Portuguese version, which is number 39 in the world? Maybe not. But you could certainly release the Brazilian version into Portugal. But certainly Brazil is like, you have to. Okay, India. Now this is maybe something that people haven't considered yet, but certainly when you look at the population, which is immense, and the number of gamers, and then the revenue at the moment, it's number 16, but I think that will jump up very, very quickly. And if you can release out there and you can get out there early, build some loyalty, build a kind of a name for your title, then you could be getting kind of ahead of the game. All right, so huge, full of young people. Country contains 1.3 billion citizens, and which is a weird stat. And I'd read this a number of times, but 2/3 of them are under 35 years old. Now maybe that's the mortality rate, I don't know. But it's an incredible number of people that are usually within that demographic that you're probably making games for. Second largest smartphone user base in the world, and is home to 10% of the global gaming audience. 10% are in India. It's like, dude, that is massive. Okay, second largest market in terms of internet population. And yeah, we see this certainly growing, and it seems the projections seem to be pointing in this direction. And so 89% of revenues from mobile games. Console hasn't really quite kind of done the business over there yet, or PC. Turkey, right? Okay, so this is the second to last one. So number 18 in the market. Now again, so this is a market where more and more requests are coming through for Turkish. I think this is going to grow a lot more. But when you look at the population and the number of gamers, that's a really good split as well. But the proficiency, again, is really poor. So again, this is because it doesn't go right to left or anything like that. This again is a fairly kind of simple language to localize into, and certainly is something that is well worth looking at. And again, with the Turkish consumers as well, they really kind of their loyalty is really kind of assured. If you release a good game and they want to play it and they play it in Turkish, then they will want to play the next game. They'll want to play another game from your stable. So that's definitely something. Turkey is like a really kind of loyal territory. So 30 million gamers, full of young gamers, and just purely the number of gamers is more than the total population of many countries. So it's considered to be the kind of the center of the Middle East and North Africa kind of region. So it's usually the kind of the first one that people go into. So again, mobile gaming is like the big driving force behind this Turkish growth. And there's 50 million smartphone users. 50 million in Turkey. And I don't imagine there's a bunch of guys in here that are making mobile games. It's like 50 million. That's pretty good. Again, English proficiency, or proficiency outside of Turkish, 80% don't speak any other language apart from Turkish. So if you want to hit these people, it needs to be in Turkish. Okay, Saudi and the United Arab Emirates. So Saudi's 22, UAE's 35. Again, both of them very low proficiency. Again, like I said before, I'm going to skip through some of these number ones quickly, and then you can contact me and I can send you the presentation so you can have these numbers. So the fifth most spoken language in the world, 420 million speakers. Crazy. And Saudi's usually the kind of most attractive when we localize into Arabic, and then followed by UAE, Kuwait, and Bahrain. And the smartphone penetration in Saudi is 46% in 2019 so far. And this is an incredible stat. So more than 40% of Saudis pay for in-app purchases, right? With some spending up to $1,000 a month. I don't imagine that's a huge number of people that are spending $1,000 a month, but people are spending $1,000. Like, whoa, okay. Okay, so cautious entry. So some people might be saying, hey, even if your game doesn't have many words, you kind of think, oh, you know what, this localization can be a pain in the ass. Do I really want to kind of be doing this stuff? What we always recommend is, test the water. Test the water by basically translating your description text, metadata for the stores, because like I pointed out at the very beginning, 46% of people will not purchase unless they can understand what's on the screen. So at least if you have that and you explain that the game itself is not translated yet, then that's fine. They will appreciate that. But the ability for them to actually be able to kind of look through the store and understand what game proposition you're offering, then that's a massive jump in the right direction, which will set you apart from other your competitors. And then, so people come back and say, oh, this is great, and I've been playing this game, and the feedback is, oh, wouldn't it be great if it was in Turkish? Then you can then look at maybe doing the full game. Okay, so then I've got this start again. We're not going to spend too long on this. No. Sorry, that was really not long at all. Okay, so basically, kind of, if your budget is a tight one, which is totally understandable, then it's a case of kind of looking at so this is the languages you should be hitting. So obviously, if you're doing English, you're going to cover a lot of stuff here. But certainly, so I'd imagine most of you guys would do Russian if you're doing Steam anyway. But certainly, if you look at it, like Spanish is massive on Steam. The Steam stats are very, very easy to get hold of anyway. But look, you've got here Brazilian Portuguese. I mean, so makes total sense. And then we've got iOS and then Google Play as well. So you've got kind of some things jump out. So, so South Korea will generate a huge amount of revenue on Google Play. And it's kind of like, why aren't people kind of looking at that? It's kind of like, and then you've got Taiwan down there as well. So, so you should be looking at, so that's using traditional Chinese. So Taiwan, traditional Chinese. And then you've got China here for iOS, which would be simplified Chinese. So again, so there's two different. So if you're trying to release traditional Chinese, if you just do one Chinese version and then you're trying to do it on iOS and Google Play, then you're going to have problems because the traditional Chinese will not be accepted in mainland China. Okay, are you ready for lock? Some simple localization considerations. So again, so this is from a kind of localization company kind of background. Basically, if you can prepare your localization, instead of just going, here's my Excel file, or here's a link to my shared doc, and saying, crack on, and just translate, then as you progress through the whole kind of process, you'll get so many questions, this, that, and that from the translators, and you'll kind of like, why did I bother doing this in the first place? So basically you just, it's, the game name. The amount of times we receive an Excel file and they say, can you translate this? And it's like, sure, what's it called? We don't know nothing about the game whatsoever. So we have to then go, okay, can tell us about the platforms, who are you targeting? Is it is it children's friendly game? So the kind of the translation needs to be friendly for, an 8-year-old child. So, it's really important to understand these things. And then, if possible, if there's video, if there's screenshots, if there's code, fantastic, because most translators, especially the ones that we work with, they're very much games translators. So they want to play games, and if they can see a game before it's released and play it, they're like super happy. So you're going to get the best quality translation if they can get hands-on. Oh yes, sorry, and then previous translations, that's important as well. So if you've translated it with someone else, then make sure that you've got those translations for the new people. All right, special characters. Okay, so there's a few here. So these are just like real top line ones, which are very, very simple to not explain. And then when the translations are delivered back to you, then you go, this is broken because they've changed this kind of this requirement, but they didn't tell us what the requirement was. So for example, like a /n to denote a line break. Do you need to have a space before it? Can it sit right up against the last character? This is stuff that can then break the game or make the game look really crappy. Characters you can't support, so you should always support umlauts and accents and things, because obviously, again, actually, so many people, they think, okay, so if it's an A with an accent, that's just the same as an A. It's like, no, it's not. Somebody's going to read that and go, this is trash. Right, so you need to support all these special characters. So, for example, this is one that just bites me regularly. So the triple dot here. So, if somebody's working in Word, then it will automatically kind of create the special character with the ellipsis. So, and then sometimes that will just break people's games. It's like, okay, great. So yeah, so stuff like that, we need to kind of make sure we tell the translators, make sure you do not create these special characters, or maybe it doesn't matter. So regularly, we get requests for, we'll receive a document, and it will have square brackets, and it will have a variable in the square brackets. But then somewhere else in the document, there'll be another square brackets, and it'll be stuff that does need to be translated. It's like, consistency is really important. So if it's stuff in square brackets, let's make sure that's stuff that's variables. And then, again, which is bonkers, but in loads of games, in a number of games, the variables themselves are kind of locked into the screen at a certain location. And it's like, dude, you can't do that. You need to be able to move these things around. So it's really important to not to kind of bake these into the UI. Okay. So, I mean, people still don't do this, and I try to shout about it and say, please, it's really useful. This will save you time later. So if you can have a string description column, or if you're using a CMS or whatever, that you fill the description to give explanation to what that string actually means. So fire. So you might just have the word fire. And actually, the other day we had the word barrel. Oh, excuse me. You had the word barrel. And so it was translated as barrel, as in like a barrel that you'd have beer in. But it's actually the barrel of a gun. And it was like, okay, so somebody's playing that and going, I've got to spin my barrel. It's like, what? So yeah, so basically you got stuff like fire. So fire, aiming and shooting, or the thing that burns in the middle of a camp. To watch, yeah, so you're watching something, or is it they will watch? A kick, to kick someone from a game, or is it to kick something? So yeah, so just, especially these kind of like words that just exist on their own are very, very difficult to work with. All right, okay, so important thing as well, so different platforms, they have different terminology. So regularly we'll receive a request that will be, this is for all platforms. And it's kind of like, okay, great, but you know that controller is going to be different in certain languages, from PlayStation to Xbox or whatever it might be, or button might be different in Italian. So yeah, so what you should try to do, if you've got stuff that's actually related to the hardware itself, or names of buttons, etc., those should sit separately. So you should have a batch for each of the platforms. And again, it might cost you a little bit more money, but there's usually not that many platform-specific things. So it might cost you a little bit of money, but it will mean that you don't get bounced back from PlayStation or from whatever the format holder is with an error later on. And, oh, can you translate this quickly for Xbox? It's like, if you'd have done it separately, then we could have done it at the same time. Don't assume the translation for a string will be the same for an identical string. It's all context-based. So you need to kind of ensure that, just because something is a duplicate in your source language version, it might not be a duplicate actually for another language. So send all the duplicates, and then we will take care of the duplicates ourselves. Okay, it's mobile and console. This is kind of touching the thing again. So the requirement for touch and press. So you're talking about pressing buttons, and then that then appears in the mobile version. It's like, that's crap. Okay, so this is what I mentioned before. So who is the line delivered by? Who's it directed to? What gender is the speaker? This is all very important stuff, like Spanish especially, and Brazilian, and a number of things, and Russian as well, of course. Sorry, I should point out, in my list before, I didn't point out Russian because I assumed that you guys would be kind of quite aware of what's happening in the Russian market. But obviously Russian would be normally in this presentation. Okay, so again, so just this kind of stuff, because if you just imagine, that you're playing a game and then there's a dialogue between characters and then it just sounds really shitty, it's just going to kind of just suck you back out of the game, and then you're going to think, well, this game is really poorly made. So the idea is, if you can create one sheet, which is the in-game text, which is kind of like the UI stuff, and then another one, which is dialogue and interaction, then you can order it properly, you can understand what the scenes are, how they appear in the game. Maybe the dialogue is referencing the story in terms of relationships between characters. So all of that stuff is really super important to provide the best quality experience for the player. Alternatively, if you put everything in one sheet, just make sure you have 2 separate sections. I mean, this is pretty kind of simplistic, but we see regularly that it doesn't happen. Okay, so usually a good idea to translate as much as possible. So the usual suspects that are not translated. So, this kills me every time. So location names, character names, the developer will say, no, we want to keep those in English or whatever language. It's like, dude, really? You want to keep that all in English? Because somebody in China will not understand what the hell that means, and then that's going to completely ruin and potentially break the game if it's something based on an objective and they can't read it and understand it. So if you don't localize certain elements, like weapons, for example, will players understand what they need to do? So, for example, this one here, you go to the hotel bar. This is an objective from a fictional game. Go to the hotel bar and hit the informant with the martillo. It's like, well, okay, great. What the hell's a martillo, right? Okay, so what the hell is it? Is it a mace? Is it a hammer? Is it like a nice dessert? We don't know what it is. But it's actually a hammer. It's like, okay, so if that was localized for them, they would understand it. But at the moment, hit them with the martillo is like, okay, I'm going to try this, I'm going to try with the water bottle. It's kind of like every single kind of weapon is just stupid. So yeah, so translate as much as possible. And then things like this, like I mentioned for the Japanese market specifically, but it applies to so many other markets. If your objective is, you have to travel 3 miles, then somebody in Brazil will be like, 3 miles? I mean, now I've got to calculate what that is. It's kind of like, it's absolutely ridiculous. So yeah, so you need to kind of make sure that it's something that's appropriate for that market. So character names. So Kim, for example, I'm not sure how popular the name Kim is in the Ukraine, but certainly in the UK, Kim is usually a female name. But in Sweden, for example, it is a male name. So you're playing a game and it says, right, you've got to look for Kim. So for me, if I'm playing the English version, I'm going to be looking for a female character, and then there might not be a female character. So I'm going to go up to every single female character going, hey, are you Kim? No, are you Kim? So that's not going to work. So in our game, where you have to hit someone with a hammer, so Kim is male. So is it going to be confusing? Are they looking for a woman? It's going to break the game. Is it even legible? Now this is just insanity. But okay, so now everything seems to be kind of related around bars. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe you know why. Right, but so this one here. So meet your informant at the Dragon Bar, and then go to the Roble pub. Now, if this was, so this is a string. This is the kind of the meaning of the string. If that was translated from Japanese, and they said, okay, we want to keep the location names in the source language, then you'd end up with this. Meet your informant at the bar, and then go to the pub. It's like, whoa, what does it mean? So you've got players today playing games going, what am I supposed to be doing here? This is madness. Wow. So yeah, so that's what's going to happen. So what you can do is you can translate it, ideally, or you can at least put it into a local alphabet. So at least they can kind of understand the kind of intention behind it. Maximum text length. Here we go. So yeah, so the usual is keep the translations to the English text, or the source. Can you just keep it to the source text? Now, if its source text is in Russian and then it's going into English, then then you're obviously you're making the game in Russian, so that's longer. So the languages should be okay-ish, maybe. But yeah, usually it's English, and then the English comes. They say keep it to the same length as English, and it's like, no, it's impossible, because most other languages are 30% longer. It's like, okay, so you're just going to end up with bleeds or cut-offs. So you need to kind of consider that scalable text. But again, if you are, if you consider, if somebody goes well over, so if somebody goes 30% over, and then the scalable text shrinks right down, it might then become totally illegible. So you need to ensure that you have that LQA pass as well to ensure that everything can be read properly. Scrollable text elements, this is kind of simplistic stuff. And then what would be really useful is actually telling the translators this is the limit. So that plus 30%, give them that limit, and then they have to stick to that limit. Now, you should also consider that if they have to use abbreviations, then regularly that can be really bad as well, and you can have like a whole string of just abbreviations, and so you end up just like, I have no idea what I'm supposed to do here. It might as well have been in Japanese. So yeah, so it's really important that text length can really ruin stuff. Right, so saving money with machine translation. Yeah, machine translation. Yeah, we're just going to stick it out there with machine translation. Don't, please. Not because of money's sake, but just purely people are going to hate your game. They're going to think that you've just basically created this game and thrown it out there, which is most likely not the case. You've spent time, you've developed an idea that you love, and you want to kind of really share it with everyone, and then you just Google Translate it and put it out there. It's like, oh, jeez. So I've got like a nice little example here, where it's supposed to be resume, right? So they've obviously it's calculated as resume, and so it's placed a curriculum vitae, and this is live. It's like, oh, good work. Well done, everyone. All right, so in summary, preparation is key. Right, so take the time to prepare your strings for translation. View your text through the player's eyes, like we were saying about the Japanese text. Oh, we want to keep the weapon names in English, for example. It's like, don't translate them. Spend time preparing. You will save time later on. We regularly, at the end of the project, it's like, oh, pickups all the time with translations, because consideration hasn't gone into these things in advance. And then obviously the developers, they're like, oh man, why is this broken? Why is this not working properly? But that could have been mitigated far earlier in the process. So yes, and then there's a few links there. So we've got a load of blogs on our webpage, which provides lots more information about good countries to target and best practices and why it's interesting for certain things are interesting in certain countries. Then we have our CMS as well. So this marshals your strings, and that's a kind of licensing thing. So if you're interested in actually kind of putting your strings together and making sure they don't go wandering and start doing silly things, then you might want to look at that. And then obviously, email me if you want to have this presentation. I'll send it to you. And then open up for any questions. I shall attempt to answer. Where are we? 1:45. Okay, cheers.